For decades, public health guidelines have delivered a consistent message about our dairy choices. They urged us to buy skim milk, low-fat yogurt, and light cheese, warning that whole-fat dairy would clog our arteries. The reasoning was simple. Full-fat dairy is loaded with saturated fat, which has long been blamed for raising cholesterol and causing heart disease. But as nutrition science has evolved, researchers are uncovering a reality that is far more complex than once believed. Today, we are going to look at the latest scientific evidence to see if whole milk and cheese are actually bad for your heart. To understand this debate, we first have to go back to the mid-20th century when dietary advice changed dramatically. During this era, rising rates of cardiovascular disease prompted scientists to search for a primary dietary cause. Saturated fat quickly became the chief suspect, leading to the creation of guidelines recommending a low-fat diet. Grocery store shelves were soon flooded with low-fat and fat-free alternatives, often packed with added sugars to replace the lost flavor. For millions of people, cutting out whole milk and butter became the standard way to protect their hearts. The biological basis for this advice rested on what scientists call the lipid hypothesis. This theory states that eating saturated fat increases low-density lipoprotein cholesterol in the blood. Because high levels of this LDL cholesterol are associated with arterial plaque buildup, saturated fat was deemed dangerous. Therefore, reducing saturated fat intake was believed to be the most direct way to lower cardiovascular disease risk. However, this hypothesis treated all sources of saturated fat as if they had the exact same effect on the human body. It assumed that the fat in a glass of whole milk behaves identically to the fat in a greasy, highly processed fast food burger. In recent years, large-scale epidemiological studies have challenged this simplistic view of nutrition. Researchers began analyzing data from prospective cohort studies that track the eating habits of hundreds of thousands of people over several decades. What they discovered surprised many traditional nutritionists and health experts. Study after study failed to find a significant link between the consumption of full-fat dairy and an increased risk of heart attacks or strokes. To explain these unexpected findings, scientists introduced the concept of the dairy matrix. The dairy matrix refers to the unique physical structure of dairy products and how their nutrients interact. Food is not just a collection of isolated fats, proteins, vitamins, and minerals that we digest independently. Instead, the specific combination of these elements within dairy changes how our bodies digest and utilize them. For example, dairy is rich in calcium, phosphorus, and milk fat globule membranes. These components can actually bind to fatty acids in the digestive tract, preventing some of the fat from being absorbed. This means that when you eat cheese or drink whole milk, your body may absorb less saturated fat than expected. Furthermore, dairy fat is made of hundreds of different fatty acids, each with its own biological effect. Some of these, like butyrate and margaric acid, have been shown to have anti-inflammatory properties. Others may help regulate blood pressure and improve insulin sensitivity, counteracting the potential negative effects of saturated fat. The health effects of dairy also depend heavily on whether the product has undergone fermentation. Fermented dairy foods, such as yogurt, kefir, and aged cheese, contain live bacteria and complex bioactive compounds. During fermentation, these bacteria produce short-chain fatty acids that support a healthy gut microbiome. A healthy gut microbiome is known to play a crucial role in regulating systemic inflammation and metabolic health. Clinical trials have consistently shown that fermented dairy products do not adversely affect blood lipids in the way predicted by their fat content. In fact, some studies suggest that eating yogurt and cheese might actually be linked to a slightly lower risk of cardiovascular disease. This protection is thought to come from the fermentation process itself and the vitamins produced, such as vitamin K2. Vitamin K2 is essential for directing calcium into the bones and keeping it out of the arterial walls where plaque forms. By preventing arterial calcification, fermented dairy may play an active role in maintaining cardiovascular health. This is why aged cheeses, despite being high in saturated fat and sodium, do not show the expected negative health outcomes in clinical studies. We also need to look closer at how dairy fat influences our cholesterol levels. It is true that eating full-fat dairy can increase LDL cholesterol, which is why guidelines still advise caution. However, cholesterol is not as simple as just measuring total LDL and total HDL levels. LDL particles come in different sizes, ranging from small, dense particles to large, buoyant ones. Small, dense LDL particles are easily oxidized and are highly associated with plaque formation in the arteries. Large, buoyant LDL particles, on the other hand, are less prone to oxidation and are considered much less harmful. Research shows that the saturated fat in dairy primarily increases the larger, benign LDL particles rather than the small, dense ones. Additionally, full-fat dairy consumption often increases HDL cholesterol, which helps clear excess cholesterol from the bloodstream. As a result, the ratio of total cholesterol to HDL cholesterol, a key marker of heart health, remains largely unchanged. This lipid profile shift explains why the cardiovascular impact of dairy fat appears to be neutral in clinical observations. Another important aspect is the relationship between dairy fat, body weight, and metabolic health. For years, people chose low-fat options because they believed cutting calories from fat would help them lose weight. However, dietary fat is highly satiating, meaning it helps you feel full and satisfied after a meal. When fat is removed from dairy, it is often replaced with carbohydrates or starch, which can cause rapid spikes in blood sugar. These blood sugar fluctuations can lead to increased hunger and overeating later in the day. Several long-term studies have found that individuals who consume full-fat dairy do not gain more weight than those consuming low-fat versions. In fact, some research suggests that whole dairy consumption is associated with a lower risk of obesity and type 2 diabetes. The biological mechanisms are still being studied, but the satiety factor and specific fatty acids in dairy likely play a key role. By helping to regulate appetite and improve insulin response, full-fat dairy can support overall metabolic stability. This suggests that avoiding dairy fat in the name of weight control may actually be counterproductive for many people. Despite this mounting evidence, major health organizations remain cautious about changing their official recommendations. The American Heart Association still advises limiting saturated fat to less than 10% of total daily calories. They recommend choosing fat-free or low-fat dairy products to minimize cardiovascular risks. The concern is that high saturated fat intake could still elevate heart disease risk in vulnerable populations. However, other guidelines, such as the latest dietary guidelines for Americans, have begun to adopt a broader perspective. They recognize that dairy, including whole-fat options without added sugars, can be part of a healthy dietary pattern. This shift reflects a growing agreement among researchers that we should focus on whole foods rather than isolated nutrients. Instead of obsessing over saturated fat percentages, we should look at the quality and variety of our entire diet. A diet rich in vegetables, fruits, whole grains, and healthy fats can easily accommodate moderate amounts of full-fat dairy. But if your overall diet is high in ultra-processed foods and refined sugars, adding full-fat dairy won't solve the underlying issues. It is also crucial to acknowledge that individual responses to dietary fat can vary significantly. Genetics, baseline metabolic health, and activity levels all influence how our bodies process saturated fats. Some people, known as hyperresponders, experience a dramatic increase in LDL cholesterol when they eat saturated fat. For these individuals, continuing to limit full-fat dairy and focusing on unsaturated fats may be the safest approach. For others, incorporating moderate amounts of whole milk, yogurt, and cheese can be a satisfying and nutritious choice. When choosing dairy, prioritizing minimally processed and fermented options like Greek yogurt and traditional cheese is key. These options provide the greatest density of beneficial nutrients and probiotics with the least amount of artificial additives. We must also remember that nutrition is highly personal, and there is no single diet that works perfectly for everyone. The goal should be to find a sustainable, balanced way of eating that supports your unique body and lifestyle. Please keep in mind that the information in this video is for general educational purposes and does not constitute medical advice. You should always consult with a qualified healthcare provider or a registered dietitian before making significant changes to your diet. They can help you analyze your blood lipid panels and design a personalized nutrition plan that suits your specific needs. We hope this scientific breakdown helps you make more informed decisions during your next trip to the grocery store. If you found this analysis helpful, please hit the like button and subscribe to Calorie Recipe for more evidence-based nutrition science. Let us know in the comments below, do you prefer full-fat or low-fat dairy in your daily routine? Thank you for watching, and we will see you in